Hello and welcome. My name is Slimy, and this is the recap and review and theories for episode 6 of Westworld, The Adversary. In the spirit of white hats, gray hats, and black hats, I figured I would wear my goofy hat while we discuss Westworld. Just to preface everything here, obviously we're going to be getting into a lot of spoilers, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, you definitely want to put this on pause, go watch the episode, and then come back, and then you can yell at me for not getting any of your theories right. So why don't we just jump right on into things. Something that I found extremely interesting was the fact that this episode features no Dolores whatsoever, which I actually really enjoyed, not because I don't like the character. I love Dolores, William, and Logan, but it actually gave us a lot more time to focus on a lot of the other things going on inside, primarily Delos, inside this episode. There's very little going on in the park. We get a couple scenes with the Man in Black and Teddy on their continued journey to find Wyatt to get to the maze. What Wyatt's connection truly is to the maze has yet to be revealed. We start the episode off at Maeve at her house, waking up before going to the saloon, and she gets herself killed intentionally so that she can end up back in Delos, where she then proceeds to essentially manipulate Felix into revealing more about who she is, her reason for existence. He takes her on a tour throughout the facility, showing her everything from, where they all get cleaned up after they get killed, to blood first being pumped in and the heart taking its first beats, through the design sculpture process, and, gets her back downstairs. Sylvester shows up. She essentially blackmails him, ends up getting them to pretty much do anything she wants, has them mess with her attributes, making her ridiculously smart, but in the process they actually found out that someone with way higher privilege than them had already been messing with her attributes, specifically increasing her paranoia. Someone clearly sent her down this path. Now, what would be really interesting is if the line that Dolores said to Maeve in episode 2, these violent delights have violent ends, if we find out more about what that code does. We've up until this point we've just thought, oh well, that code just kind of boom triggers something, but what if that was something planted in by Arnold that actually raises that level of paranoia, raises the attributes that start pushing something towards self-awareness and self-consciousness. I know we're getting a little bit into the theories a little too early, but I did want to put that out there. I thought that was really interesting, that someone way above them. I mean, they don't say it was just coders. It was someone with privileges way above theirs that made these changes and essentially pushed her onto this journey that they are now happily assisting her on. The next characters are Elsie and Bernard, and in a way, Bernard and Ford. Ford is a bit more of a supporting character throughout this episode. He's definitely in it a lot, and his, just like every episode, his scenes are the most crucial scenes, but they're kind of there more to support other stories, I want to say. So Bernard and Elsie are looking more into the mystery behind the woodcutter and the saboteur. Elsie thinks she's really close to finding out who it is. She's 100% positive that whoever's doing it is doing it from within the company. This is not some hack job that's being done inside the park. But she can't access some of the information on the woodcutter because of how the woodcutter destroyed itself. Bernard reveals that the woodcutter is actually one of the old hosts, and that the information can still be retrieved through the old legacy system. So Bernard goes on this journey, he hops in the elevator and goes down into the basements. He makes it down to B82, which is worth noting is one floor above B83, which we saw in the first episode as the location for cold storage. It's a restricted area, so Bernard has to give his name. He's given permission, which makes me wonder, is this just because the legacy system is really well mated in with the modern system, in which case it makes me wonder how come Elsie couldn't find out the information she needed. Or has Bernard just really been with the company long enough that he worked in that facility at some point in time, and does that sort of longevity with the company represent him not being Arnold, him not being a host, him not being the consciousness of Arnold inside a host, or the complete opposite? Maybe it's a confirmation of all of those things. We're not entirely sure quite yet, but he apparently has permission. The door's open. He gets in there. We get two really neat Easter eggs in this scene. The one is the music. It's not the music as a whole as much as one specific instrument in it. It's like an electronic drum almost, a very rapid kind of tapping. It's actually from the original movie, and it's just kind of blended in with the Westworld soundtrack. And then the other neat Easter egg is when Bernard actually gets inside that office, he pans his flashlight around, and we actually get a glimpse of Yul Brynner's gunslinger from the original 1973 Westworld. Now, a lot of people want to immediately jump on the notion that, oh, we see Yul Brynner's character, maybe that's what the incident was 30 years ago. I want to say that almost intentionally, a scene later on is very intentionally designed to completely quash this theory. In the original movie, the faces actually come off of the hosts like a mask of sorts. In a later scene, when we see another early generation host, one of the true first model ones, Ford is interacting with it and issues it a command, and its face actually opens up in 4 pieces and just kind of separates, and it's totally different. To think that that would be the incident that happened 30 years ago, while it's really neat, I don't think that that's actually what's going on. I think just putting the little Yul Brynner thing in there, I think that's just a really neat little Easter egg and just a nod to the past. So then next we have Bernard sits down at the computer, and then we're going to have to kind of digress a little bit and pull away from our recap. We're going to have to get into some things right now. Bernard sits down at the computer, and he turns it on, and the first thing we see is the old Westworld logo, and then we see it again when he goes to actually log into the machine. We've seen the original Westworld logo when William first arrived at the park. He sees it when he gets to the top of the escalator that's showing the hey, welcome to Westworld, you're going to do whatever you want to do here, Westworld, and it shows that logo. We see that logo again when Ford has his flashback when he's talking to Bernard and talking about before the park opened while they were still working on the facility. We see it on all the lab techs' coats as they're part of their uniforms. We also see it in episode 1 when Stubbs and some of those other members from that crew go down with Bernard to cold storage. When they open up the cold storage doors, you actually see the old Westworld logo on it. Now, we're more familiar with what's considered the modern Westworld logo, which would be the same logo that appears when you turn the TV on to go to watch the television show. But this same logo also appears behind Lee Sizemore when he's giving his presentation for the brand new narrative that he is proposing that Ford shoots down. We also see it when Ford goes up to the park in episode 2 when he first encounters that little boy that we now know to be a version of Robert Ford as a child. Before he gets on that elevator, he walks past a pillar that lists the floor number, and in addition to listing the floor number, it also shows the current Westworld logo. We definitely see a split between where we see these logos, which is another indication to the whole timeline fracture and whether or not we're seeing things congruently or not. But we're going to get into that a little bit later. I don't want to digress too much, but logos. This is J.J. Abrams we're talking about, Bad Robot Studios, and Jonathan Nolan. Nothing is accidental. Bernard finds out this information, sends it to Elsie. Elsie's able to determine that the satellite that it's also sending the information to is a Delos satellite. So not only is the saboteur coming from the inside, but they are using Delos' own technology to smuggle the data out. So this is a really crazy inside job. She's able to use the tracking information to locate specifically where it's coming from. It's an abandoned theater in Sector 3. Now, we've not heard of any of the towns referred to by their sectors before, so we're not quite sure where in the park Sector 3 is. And we only see the exterior of the theater in a night shot. We don't see any buildings really around it, so it's hard to tell how populated the town might be, if there's anyone even in the town. The whole town could very well be abandoned. Meanwhile, Bernard discovers that there's 5 more anomalies in the park in an area called Sector 17. I'd have to assume it's inaccessible by guests. It's marked as being off limits. Bernard does some digging and finds out that there's supposedly nothing unusual there, so he decides to go check it out himself. When he gets there, he finds that it's like a piney wooded area. It looks nothing like the rest of the southern Utah desert that we had seen previously on any of the episodes. And he finds this house where he sees this man who looks vaguely familiar. So Bernard, not thinking anything of it because he thinks he has, total control over these things, walks inside the house all willy-nilly and finds a family of 4 and a dog inside, representing the 5 anomalies. The man turns around and spots him, and suddenly we realize that this is the very same man that was in the photograph with Robert Ford in episode 3, when Ford and Bernard have their little chat in Ford's office about, how the park got created and Ford's original partner, Arnold. And we all assumed that, Ford showed that photograph to Bernard and it was a picture of him and Arnold. But now we're finding out that this older man is actually a representation of Ford's father. Now, before I get into furthering the recap of that, I just want to kind of go back. I once again, I'm going to have to look at the photograph, but I'm pretty sure the photograph shows a younger Ford, much like the Ford we see in the flashback, with a similarly aged man that we see to be presumed as Arnold in that episode and find out to be Ford's father, as far as we're concerned, in this episode. I have trouble believing either or. I don't think Ford's being at all honest with Bernard. If that was his father and Ford was lying to Bernard in episode 3 when he showed him that photograph, and it's supposedly a photograph of just him with his father, then it'd be hard to believe that the character we're seeing, the host that we're seeing, is the same person, because while the hosts don't age, since this is a representation of Ford's family at a very specific point in time in his life, and Ford is actually the young little boy who we're presuming to be somewhere in the age range of 6 to 10 maybe. He looks almost identical as he does in the picture. So part of me wants to say that the host itself is Arnold, but consciousness, sure, but it's representative of Ford's father in some way. I'm having a lot of trouble even just spitting this out. It's such a complete screw job with the mind, but if you look at the picture and then look at the man that you see in the house, they look the same age, but Ford changes age. Like, Ford's clearly a man in his 40s in that picture, and you know, we're seeing this maybe 10-year-old Ford in this house with a man of a similar age that's apparently Ford's father. So that's interesting. Meanwhile, the host turns around, confronts him, you know, who are you? And Bernard says, are you Arnold? And the guy goes, who is Arnold? And then proceeds to grab him. Bernard tries to issue voice commands to stop it. It doesn't work. There's this look on the little boy's face. Now, we've seen this little boy on his walk with Ford, and we've seen this little boy show up in the last episode when he met the man in black, and then not too long after, Ford meets with the man in black. You know, and there's a lot of theories out there that this little boy was Ford's eyes and ears inside the park, and now we're finding out he's literally him. Does he have some sort of almost instant communication with Ford? Because quite instantaneously, just a moment later, Ford is suddenly there in the building, right next to Bernard. He appears there. He did not walk through a door. He did not come in from anywhere. He is standing almost in the same exact corner as Bernard is and was not there a moment before, and he puts an end to everything. And he's, you know, the hosts go back into their passive manner, and Bernard begins to question Ford about, you know, what he had just seen. He asks, who are they? To which Ford replies, they're ghosts. They were first-generation hosts. They were created by Arnold personally for Ford as a gift of what Ford says was his only happy memory from his childhood, from a family vacation to this, you know, house in the woods that they would go to. And we finally also get to see the Greyhound that Ford was talking about when he was talking to Wild Bill at the beginning of last week's episode. Now, Bernard's really concerned about this because he doesn't like the idea of there being unregistered hosts in the park and the sort of repercussions that can come from that. He expresses his concern about it, and Ford kind of just brushes it off, asks him to allow him, you know, indulge me this little discretion of sorts and forget about it, to which, you know, Bernard's like, all right, and he leaves. Later, Ford is seen walking. He encounters the little boy again. He finds out the little boy murdered the dog, and when interviewing him and analyzing him, has an exchange after finding out the boy has lied to him about killing, and the little boy says, someone told me to put it out of its misery. Who told you? A voice. Whose voice? Arnold. He told me it was a killer, but it wasn't its fault. It was made that way, and I couldn't help it. Help it? If it was dead, it couldn't hurt anything anymore. This line has some serious repercussions in terms of Westworld, because people come to Westworld to inflict pain. This is where people come to live out their, you know, their wildest and most fun fantasies, but it's also where people come out to live out some of their most sadistic fantasies and to do things they could never get away with in the real world. As far as the hosts are concerned, this is very real. You know, they're being hurt. So for a host to sit there and to kill something, even though I do believe the dog was a host itself, because Ford does say he can repair it no problem, the fact that the little boy kills it by saying, and then justifies it by saying that, well, I killed it so it can't hurt anything else. It's just one line of code that's preventing it from being a guest next time. And I think that's really interesting. And to kind of tie things back up between this like trifecta of characters here between Ford, Elsie, and Bernard, and going down this rabbit hole, so to speak, Elsie is still in the abandoned theater. She finds out more information. She contacts Bernard while Bernard is in a room with Teresa, where Elsie reveals that the saboteur is Teresa. She is the one who is smuggling data out of the park. We're not quite sure how Bernard handles this because we don't see what he says further to Teresa beyond this, although he did start his meet with Teresa by expressing concern over Ford. So even though now he realizes Teresa's kind of the bad guy, he accidentally said a little too much about Ford before finding out that Teresa is a spy. So Ford's now definitely in a bit of a compromised position. His most closest confidant in the entire park system has just betrayed his confidence to someone who's actively trying to sabotage the park. Teresa made it pretty clear that she was not a fan of Westworld, that a place like this was not for her. So we're not quite sure entirely what her motives are for all of this, but we did find out that she is the saboteur and she is not to be trusted. Bernard calls Elsie back, and Elsie says that someone has been using the bicameral control system for weeks to retask the hosts. It had to be the older models, serious modifications, changing loops, breaking loops, and making alterations to prime directives that could allow the host to not only lie to them in interview sessions, but could also allow them to harm the guests. When Bernard asks who was behind this, Elsie says, it seems like it was Arnold, to which Bernard's like, well, he's dead, and she says, well, he's a pretty prolific coder for a dead guy, and then says, whatever argument he was having with Ford, it doesn't seem like he was done making his point. And then she says she was going to wrap things up, meet him in his office, and tell him all the rest of his stuff. Before this could happen, famous last words, I'll see you in just a little bit. There's suddenly a creaking sound, and Elsie makes the biggest mistake by actually calling out. Now, why anyone would call out hello in a dark, abandoned place when they're alone in a place they shouldn't be is beyond me, but it ultimately gets her captured by someone. And then we can't forget, we didn't spend a whole lot of time with them, but the little bit of time we did spend with them, a lot unfolded, and that was the Man in Black and Teddy. Our first scenes with them show them riding together on their way to Pariah, where Teddy tells the Man in Black a little more about what the maze is, and says, the maze itself is a sum of a man's life, the choices he makes and the dreams he hangs on to. And, to kind of surmise the rest of the quote, because I didn't type all of it out, it speaks of a man at the center of the maze, a legendary man who was killed over and over and over again, but always seemed to come back to life. He came back one time, vanquished all of his foes, built this house, and then built this maze around it that no one could get to, so that he'd finally be left alone. Teddy says there's another way, and he takes him to this small Union soldier outpost and says, we gotta go down there and shoot our way through. To which the Man in Black is like, you're gonna get yourself killed. We gotta go about this a better way. They spot two Union soldiers, take their uniforms, go down there. One of the Union soldiers recognizes Teddy. We get this awesome flashback where we find out that Teddy was shooting down Union soldiers right alongside Wyatt. That Teddy was a bad guy at one point in this, new narrative. And that it looks like he kind of distanced himself from Wyatt once Wyatt took a more sadistic turn and started mutilating people instead of just killing them. They get captured. Then what's interesting is Teddy is actually about to be branded by one of the Union soldiers with the Maze logo. Teddy breaks out, he knocks a bunch of people out and probably kills them by beating them with that brand. The Man in Black shoots some people before Teddy actually jumps up and grabs a Gatling gun and kills every Union soldier in the encampment. After informing the Man in Black that they couldn't run away, they would simply be followed, so leave no survivors. Teddy finally fixed his kill-death ratio. Good on him. That poor bastard deserved it. Alright, so I think that about covers it for our little recap session of the episode. In terms of a review, I think this was a very, very well-paced episode. I think the exclusion of the Dolores William Logan story was nice. It was a bit of a change of pace, and it actually gave more time to develop other storylines and to find out a little more about what's going on. Continuing the trend, we've gotten morsels of answers with heapings of questions. We found out a lot more about the inner workings of Delos, which is something we're constantly yearning more of. We're always trying to figure out what goes on behind the scenes at this place. And seeing it through Maeve's point of view was really interesting, having Felix walk her around. Although the one thing that kind of rubbed me the wrong way was the fact that no one thought it was odd that they were walking around. I do understand that hosts are led around these corridors and stuff, often clothed, but they are with behavior specialists who all wear the same outfits. This guy didn't even bother changing into civvies. I mean, he was wearing his "I'm the guy at the bottom of the barrel, they give me plastic clothes because I get so much blood on them" outfit in a place where he has no business being, and somehow he gets away with it. I think that's going to be the big plot twist of this season, is that we are indeed seeing two different timelines here. Some of the big indications are last week in episode 5, we open up with Dolores in the graveyard. It's a really wide shot, and we get those flashes of the church, and there are plenty of the videos and breakdowns of that church. I'm not really going to get into it in this video. It's a shot that if there were other people there with her, we would see, because the camera pans around, and just too close by to her suddenly is William, Logan, Slim, and the horses. They weren't there a moment ago. She was there by herself. I don't know quite what to make of the fact, then that she did say something out loud, but which time frame was that? Was that when no one was there with her, or did that happen in the William timeline? Because William says, "Who were you just talking to?" But the very last scene we see with Dolores is when her and William confront Lawrence on the train, and Lawrence and William sit down at the end of the train to share a drink. There's a bunch of very unique things, a crate with some bottles in it next to him. There's the 2 lights. There is the unique benches. And there's a great shot of the 2 of them sitting at it. And then there's, from a couple of the other shots, there's the exact positioning of the coffins. Well, we get a reversal shot on Dolores, and William and Lawrence are nowhere to be found. It's clearly the benches they were just sitting in, the crate's right next to them, the lights are right there, the coffins are facing the correct direction, but Dolores is suddenly alone in the shot. And I don't know why I didn't notice it until I think it was my 3rd or 4th watch through. But the first 3 times, I just remember staring at that scene and feeling, this is a really awkward shot. It's just Dolores standing there by herself. Why are they utilizing that shot instead of a shot with her standing with William and Lawrence? And then that's when I realized that's because William and Lawrence aren't there. And she's on this journey again by herself. It's kind of weird, and it could be a continuity issue, it could not be, but if she's on this journey by herself, then who's in that coffin that the Maze imprint is on? Is that coffin always there, and it's just whether or not Slim's in it? Because you'd have to think that without William and Logan there, Slim doesn't make it back to Pariah. It's likely that someone just brings him back to Sweetwater. Even if Slim does get brought back to Pariah, if the techs hadn't finished up with Lawrence after the Man in Black and El Lazo wasn't back yet, do the Union soldiers ever even get ambushed? If there are no guests there to take on that storyline, does anyone even bother with the Union soldiers? So I'm not entirely sure who's even in that coffin, or why that coffin is still on the train if Dolores is on it by herself and the William and Lawrence thing hasn't happened. And that's what makes the whole timeline thing really confusing to me, is because there are a bunch of holes in that theory in terms of how these loops play out and how things can change based on guest interaction with the world, and how the guests can change things. That's why these things have the ability to improvise when necessary. Who ends up in that coffin? Is whoever in that coffin still filled with nitro? Is there even anyone in the coffin? Maybe there's just always an empty coffin in that train, and whether or not Slim is in it is just a product of whether or not the storyline is completed the right way. Got into it earlier with like the logos, and we have like an old logo here and here and here, and then we've got like new logos here. So it starts getting really confusing. And so that wraps it up for this week's episode, this week's debut episode. I know it was a little rough around the edges. I was definitely a little more scattered than I wanted to be when I put this all together. I kind of decided to sort of wing it a little bit before sitting down and doing this, and that's why there's a million jump cuts all over this, because there is just so much going on in this show, and it's just so hard to try to really keep track of absolutely everything. Week in and week out, the show's got me coming back for more, so that really says something. I do believe next week we're going to see a lot of Dolores, William, and Logan's storyline. And I think next week's episode, because it will be so Dolores-centric, I think we may finally get the closest confirmation that we'll get as to whether or not we're seeing one or two timelines. But at this point, up until last week, I really wanted to put a video out today that sat there and said, you guys are all tinfoil hat Looney Tunes and it's one timeline. But after last week's episode, with Dolores being alone in a bunch of those scenes before William would just suddenly just magically appear or disappear, and the continuation of the clear distinction between legacy logo and modern logo. I'm really curious as to where we're going to go from here with all of this. So if you liked the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. You know, this was a debut episode here, so I would love some feedback on all this, and let me know what you think, what you'd like to see next week and next week's breakdown. So I will see you all either later this week or next week for the next episode breakdown, and until then, I will see you next time.